Hello, and welcome to The Green Room by Deloitte, an award-winning podcast where we explore the topics that matter most in business. I'm George Parrott, and this is episode number 56, where we ask, what if we all lived to 100?
First thing that comes to my mind, and maybe yours too, Tim, is, but how will our health systems cope with this?
It's not just the diet and the exercise, it's the sense of community, the sense of having a strong social group, as you go into your 90s.
I like to think of life in chapters. I like to think that you might have several chapters of a working life.
When someone retires, you automatically offer them, positions in other departments. You create a culture that is rather different. It's not all or nothing.
Hello, and thank you so much for tuning into this episode of The Green Room. I'm delighted to be joined by our new host, Annie Wong. How are you, Annie?
Good, thanks, George. Very happy to be here.
Excellent. And we're talking about longevity today, life expectancy, what happens if we all live to 100. And you're someone who's obviously full of life, Annie. So what have you done today that's healthy?
Today, as with every day, I walked my dog in the woods bright and early. It's lovely.
Excellent. What's your dog's name?
Sam.
Sam. Excellent. Well, we will have to do a full episode of dogs, I think, at some point.
Absolutely.
And that actually, as a dog owner myself, I've learned a lot. That is actually a key to longevity and health as well. And it's a topic that we're talking about. It's a topic that I think I read about. The first mention of the fountain of youth was in Herodotus in the 5th century BC. So it's a topic that's fascinated the humans and civilizations for years. And we're going to be looking at it today. We're going to look at what happens if we all live to 100, what the impacts might be from a health perspective, how do we look after people as they get older, how do we pay for that, what do businesses need to think of. But Annie, we obviously need some experts in the studio to help us today. So who have we got to talk us through this topic?
Yes, today we are joined by Professor Tim Spector OBE. Tim is a professor in genetic epidemiology at King's College London, director of the Twins UK study and co-founder of Zoe. In 2020, he was awarded an OBE for services to the COVID-19 response. He's also an author, and his latest book, Food for Life, is out now. Welcome, Tim.
Hello, great to be here.
We're also joined by Sara Siegel. Sara is the global healthcare sector leader at Deloitte. She's worked with the NHS and healthcare clients for the last 20 years in the UK and across Europe, and has led projects on digital transformation and the use of artificial intelligence to improve the speed and quality of NHS services. Welcome, Sara.
Thank you.
So, to ease us in to the mammoth topic of the day of what if we all live to 100, I'll come to you, Sara, first. What's one thing that you've done, a healthy daily habit that you've done today or will do today?
I'll do two, and I'd love your comments on these, Tim. So I try not to have breakfast and do some intermittent fasting, just have coffee, milk, which I love, in the mornings to just compress the amount of time I'm eating and the number of calories I consume. And also, on the days that I come into the office, just through all of the walking I end up doing to and from the tube and around our large campus, I get my 10,000 steps.
Oh, yeah.
Great. Tim, what about you?
Well, I agree with those ones, by the way, so we're off to a good start. And do something similar. So I haven't had breakfast this morning, and we'll either have a late breakfast or a brunch, or I'll skip it to get into the fasting. But I decided that my core is to look after my gut microbes. And if you look after your gut microbes, they'll let you live to 100. And to do that, we can go into the details, but basically eating lots of plants, fermented foods, diverse stuff, and no junk foods.
Lovely. Although all this talk of breakfast is making me hungry.
Yeah. I mean, my healthy act was I managed to resist a pain au chocolat, which is on our kitchen tables today. So I feel really proud of myself for resisting that. But
well done. Nice.
I'm feeling it now that maybe stomach rumbles can be being picked up on the microphones now. But Sara, Tim, it's great to have you in, and we're sort of talking about what happens if we all live to 100. But why is 100 such a milestone or a landmark? Why is it such a psychological goal for everyone to reach?
And it used to be a really rare occurrence. So people used to go on the local newspapers and, TV, and it used to be a big thing. And I remember, when we studied twins, and when we had a pair of twins that reached 100, that was national news.
And now I think we're in a society where I think a child, 1 in 3 children born in 2016 are going to live to 100, I suppose, based on current factors. So the novelty is going to wear off then, presumably.
I think so, yes. But, there's still something about it. Centenarian, it's a round number. I think, you look back in history and, it's still a major milestone, I think. I remember we have birthdays every year, but if you go to a place like China, they sort of celebrate surviving your first 10 years of life. Then they don't bother until you get to about 70. And then it's a celebration that you've lived that long, which actually makes much more
sense. Like wedding anniversaries almost, is it?
Yeah, exactly. So, but I think, rather than this idea of, you're in middle age and, who cares if you're 45 or 46, it's not a cause for celebration to have made it. So I think we might turn back to that time and have these sort of milestone ones. But hopefully we're going to talk more about why it's, lifespan rather than so health span rather than lifespan is important. No point all of us living to 100 if we're in nursing homes having had a stroke with diabetes and we haven't been out for 20 years. So that's the current problem we're in. We are living longer, but we're sicker.
Yes, it's that quality of life up to 100, I suppose, rather than just getting to 100. And Sarah, perhaps that might be a nice way to talk about some of the work that you're involved with, working with, public health bodies and things as part of this sort of broader ambition to enhance life expectancy, I guess, across the nation.
It's true. When you ask the question, what's it going to be like to live to 100? The first thing that comes to my mind, and maybe yours too, Tim, is, but how will our health systems cope with this when they're already struggling to cope with us living to our, on average, mid-80s? So I think that is a big, big question for health services, which, were constructed originally for acute injuries and are now coping with very different types of health challenges. But I think what we'll spend time talking about today and what this is really about is not about when you get sick, but it's about how you live your life and all of the things that we should be doing now and for as long as possible to live a healthy life and to preserve health span, as Tim talks about. And I think one of the interesting questions is that the job of the health service? Is that the job of, in this country, the NHS? It's, not traditionally been a big part of what they do. Although when you go to the GP, they will advise you not to smoke. They will take blood pressure and do lots of preventative checks. But, in the end, it's on us. It's all the things that we've started talking about today. Did we move our bodies? Did we eat good things? Our GP's not looking over our shoulder all day long, looking at the choices we make.
Well, they're not, because it's the National Sickness Service, not the National Health Service. Basically, 99% of what they do is looking after sick people.
Yeah, it's reactive.
Literally none of our budget is designed for prevention, and, the UK and the US really are pretty terrible in that regard compared to other countries and states that, put lots of the money in prevention, which, is actually cost effective long term, dealing with more and more sick people. And as you said, the system is falling apart because there's never been more sick people in our society, even though, as you said, statistically, if you look at the age people are dying, it is increasing, but it's not everywhere. And I think, we mustn't give the impression that everyone is getting, better and longer lived. The actuarial assessments are that we've peaked and that we're going to die before our parents. With the first generation that's going to have that difference.
Yes, I think US life expectancy has gone down for the last two years, I think. So.
And ours is sort of either plateaued or slightly down compared to other countries. And that's really this huge burden of obesity and diabetes and these problems that are actually occurring earlier in life that we're not dealing with.
Yeah, I mean, the US stats are also affected by, unfortunately, drug abuse, gun violence, other things. But one of the other things that I think we should comment on is the bifurcation of that there's a strata of people like you, Tim, who cycled here today, who are taking really good care of their health and who probably have a higher chance of living to 100. And there's a strata of people who are not taking care of their health.
Yeah, it's the danger of talking about averages. And of course, no one is average. And you've got these different sectors. And, in the US and the UK, life expectancy is very much related to your socioeconomic class. And I think there's roughly a 15-year difference between, poor areas of the UK and rich areas, and it's probably even greater in the US, maybe up to about 20 years. So this is, one of the major reasons that if you had a global view and you wanted to do that, you would be bringing up those averages, not focusing just on the best people who can afford everything.
So Tim, your work with Zoe is all about empowering individuals and giving them knowledge they need about their own bodies and what they should be putting into their own bodies. Would you mind telling us a little bit more about the results that you've seen so far and what Zoe is all about?
Sure, yeah. So Zoe is a personalized nutrition company that I co-founded about 6 years ago, and it uses tech to tell people what's going on in their bodies. So we use a continuous glucose monitor that gives you your blood sugar every 5 minutes. We use a blood fat test to check what happens to your fat levels after eating a standardized meal. And we look at your gut microbiome. And we combine that with lots of other information about yourself, your exercise levels, and other diseases to give an algorithm so that you get a personalized score for every food that you might come across. So out of 100, you get to score it to see how your blood sugar reacts, your blood fat, or whether it's good for your gut microbes. And when we do that, we find that people who follow that feel better, have much more energy, they have less hunger, their mood improves, and they will lose a small amount of weight, which they can continue over time. And their gut microbes, importantly, improve, so that everything is moving in that right direction. And we see this going so that it's going to be like a way of global health checkup. So every 6 months, you might get your gut microbes tested as an indication of how you're doing aging-wise. So I think it's a very empowering way of people being able to look after their own bodies and think about food differently.
I did the Zoe pilot and I found it absolutely fascinating because, first of all, I never knew if my gut flora was good or bad or in balance or out of balance. And I found that whole analysis really interesting. And I also found the blood sugar measurement fascinating because it really tells you, what you can tolerate in terms of different foods and how they affect you. I also realized, fun fact, that on the nights when I eat dinner early with my kids, say at 5:30, in the middle of the night, my blood sugar dips super low. And it doesn't wake me up, but being asleep, you wouldn't realize that. And there are tips and tricks to fix that. So there's all kinds of learnings from it. I thought it was fascinating.
But I think it just makes you think about food in a different way to the standard, traditional. Doesn't really matter what you eat. As long as you only have 2,000 calories, you're fine. All calories are the same. Junk food's the same as real food. It's just, you got to be careful, not too much sugar. And you realize that's nonsense. Once you start testing yourself with these, the amazing technology we've got now, and you can see things that you thought were healthy giving you a big spike. I used to eat porridge in the morning. I thought, all the adverts tell me porridge is good for you. Oats, supposed to reduce your cholesterol and all this sort of stuff that they found in the 1980s. Gives me huge sugar spikes. So actually left me much hungrier. So I think people are also realizing that if they do listen to their bodies, they can actually start to tailor not only what they eat, but how they eat it.
I think what you alluded to there, Tim, is it's a topic which comes up a fair bit. We did a podcast on how to change behaviors, and it was linked to sustainability and how, and a lot of that was down to a combination of sort of peer pressure. If you see lots of electric vehicles on the road, then that might sort of spark that sort of interest. But also it's that knowledge is power piece, isn't it? And actually, if you are empowering people, as Annie said, to educate themselves about how the food they eat impacts their health, then that's going to hopefully help tackle the sort of marketing machine that you were describing earlier about that you see in.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is, I painted a very depressing picture of the UK and the US, but the good thing about it is you can change food culture very fast. So because we don't have a grandmother Mediterranean food culture where we're taught this is the right thing to do, each generation's like starting afresh, you can actually change it quickly. So, when I first started talking about 6 years ago about kefir and kombucha, no one knew what I was talking about. Now, It's in every pub, every supermarket. You can't get away from it.
We've got it upstairs.
This is incredible. In other countries, that wouldn't happen.
And Sarah, I guess linked to that from your perspective, technology has been a key enabler for Tim's work. How is technology helping the healthcare system, and how are you speaking to your clients about tackling this problem?
Yeah, technology is a huge enabler of the healthcare system, and there's lots of work happening across the NHS and systems around the world right now to improve the technology that's being used. I mean, I think one of the more interesting elements around technology when we talk about living to 100 is the opportunity to look at different data sets and put them together. So Tim's been talking a lot about food and what we buy in the grocery stores. We know that when we have data on what kinds of food people buy in grocery stores or what kinds of things they're buying even in Boots, we can infer potential health outcomes from that, and interventions can be arranged to help people with earlier diagnoses of things. So I think that's an opportunity, not something that we're doing systematically now for a lot of reasons. It's very complex and there's a lot of data rules to navigate. But I think there's huge opportunity to help people understand the choices they're making through putting data sets together about the sorts of things they're buying and consuming, and also their interactions with the health service.
And I think necessity drives invention, doesn't it, often? And you're involved in a study that we produced earlier in the summer called Time to Change, which looked at the sort of the stresses on the workforce, which we've discussed. I think 50% of nurses and midwives have considered leaving the profession entirely because of the work stresses that they're facing, which is probably not unsurprising given sort of recent headlines that we've seen. But it points to that problem and how potentially technology could help with that.
So the NHS workforce is under extreme pressure, even though we have more people in the NHS workforce than we've ever had before, more than pre-COVID. Productivity metrics show that we're doing less activity even than before COVID. And there's lots of reasons for that. But I think technology is needed. And there's lots of things that we can help the NHS implement from a technology point of view that can just take the stress off the NHS workforce. One thing that we've been working on, we call Refer Assist, which takes the burden off secondary care clinicians who are reading GP referral letters and deciding what to do with patients, specifically in different specialty pathways. It reads the letters using AI tool and triages them on behalf of the clinicians. And any letter which is unclear, doesn't have enough detail, is then referred to a human for another check. And this is something that doctors and nurses love because they hate doing clinical admin and they'd rather spend time with patients. So reading letters is something that they would love taken off their plate. And that's just one of, hundreds of examples of things that can, and I'm confident will be implemented to ease the burden on the NHS workforce.
We haven't got the systems in place to make sure that they just should do it. So we're still in a sort of rather rigid system where they say, oh, AI can help us a little bit. No, actually, AI can do this whole thing much better than you, and you can just check a few things. But there's huge resistance to that. So I don't know how long you think it's going to take.
It will take time. It will definitely take time. I think the technology will be ready well before it's widely adopted. But there are green shoots. We're doing a pilot in Canada right now, which, back to the living to 100 point, has introduced AI in sort of a chatbot. Whereas before, elderly patients living on their own at home were getting a call out periodically just to check on things. Have you taken your medication? Have you gone outside today? Now that's been replaced by an AI. And the results have been really interesting because it was a test to see how people reacted to it and if they liked it. And the response has been, it's a bit odd, they like it better than a human. And they've been more open and shared more information about their daily habits and how they're feeling with the AI, which has been trained to mirror human emotions, than they were sharing with the humans who were doing the call-outs before. And we can all guess, why that might be. The humans probably have a call sheet of 50 people, and they've got to get through them all, and they might not be as empathetic every day. They might be tired one day. They might have had a fight at home,
But the computer can be happy all the time.
Computer's always happy, exactly, and totally empathetic. So that I found fascinating.
Did you know, at Deloitte, we support social enterprises through our 5 Million Futures programme. One of my favourites is the Luminary Bakery in London, because life is about balance. They use baking as a tool to take women on a journey to employability and entrepreneurship, equipping them with transferable skills for the working world. Their letterbox brownies are incredible, and they even have a cookbook. If you fancy a taste, just head to luminarybakery.com or check out the show notes. Now, back to our topic of the day. Yeah, it makes me think of the economic implications of people living longer and who bears that cost and how that cost manifests itself across individuals, businesses, governments, etc. What would you say are some of the costs of people living longer? And do you think in the current cost of living crisis, people can even afford to live longer?
It goes back to Tim's point about health span. I mean, if we live longer, we're going to have to work longer. Pensions are already struggling. They're not set up to pay out for 50 years of a person's life. So, I mean, lots and lots of adjustments are going to have to be made for living longer.
So do you think the traditional, I guess, 3-part life stages where you have education, work, and then retirement will be completely kind of changed?
I like to think of life in chapters. I like to think that you might have several chapters of a working life. And I also like to think that there are people who might have trained as clinicians, gone off in frustration at one point, but who might like to come back at another point, maybe when the burden of clinical admin is reduced or for some other reason. So, to my mind, it would be nice. And maybe in those latter chapters of your professional life, you're not working 5 days a week, or you're doing a portfolio career, or there's other things. But I do think it will change, and it probably is already changing, yes. There was some very interesting research that came out of our U.S. firm, where obviously the employer plays a really big role in healthcare because most health insurance in the U.S. is paid for by your employer. And it showed that picking the right employer can extend your lifespan by up to 15 years.
What can businesses do to prepare for a longer living society? And are there specific things that business should do now to help pay for that cost or help prepare for the people living longer in the workplace?
I mean, I love your views on this too, Tim. I mean, I think it's an interesting paradox right now because on the one hand, people aren't staying with one employer for as long as they used to. I'm probably a dinosaur having worked at Deloitte for 20 years. Nobody does that anymore, but I like it here. But most people move after 2-5 years, and they have many, many employers throughout their career. Conversely, I think people are choosing employers based on not only the interesting nature of the work and can they learn and location, but, what is it going to do for them lifestyle-wise, and how will it help them in terms of health span? And I know, here at the firm, we've put a lot of energy and effort into thinking about that and the programs that we can put in place to support people to lead healthier lives and support them when they're not well or when their families aren't well, and especially post-COVID to make flexible working really, really easy for people. And I think that's a big part of the war for talent going forward, for sure.
So if you look at the Asian countries where people traditionally stick with one employer for 20 odd years, they're doing huge things with long-term plans about making sure people can walk or cycle to work, and joint yoga sessions that people get to know each other in communities. And you have to look at places like Singapore, which are just doing amazing things. And they're the best example of a rich country that's managed to have the highest number of centenarians and really reduced a lot of their problems, actually dealing with it. And it's the government working with the companies. But then they have this whole public health focus. But I think here, where there is no central government, the companies have got to say, okay, join us, and, we're going to keep you healthy for as long as we can. We're going to help you, give you exercise, have, ways to deal with stress, perhaps give out programs like Zoe to employees to say, okay, think about food differently, because that and that could be cost effective because you'd have less sick days and things like that long term if you thought long term rather than just in the next year.
So arguably businesses could play a positive role in helping more positive health outcomes when people do work for longer.
Exactly. Yeah. But we have to try and find a way around this problem. It's a bit like in the US, people change health insurance every 3 years. So there's no long-term incentive for that health insurance to actually look after that person because they're going to be someone else's problem that's bouncing it, onto someone else. As I think careers will change, people will be working, and then, maybe after 65, you might go part-time for the next, 10, 15 years. Or I think the idea of switching jobs and using those people's skills in another domain is the most exciting thing. And lots of studies show that people who aren't super specialists and have done lots of different things in life, are better long-term bets for a company. So companies being able to move people around and think in that way as well, which is also good for mental health. So, getting people to do things slightly out of their comfort zone, but knowing they're, protected, I think could be a sort of win-win for companies and people's mental health. But I think the idea that you get to 66 and then you retire, I don't think that's...
Do you think we should retire retirement?
For most people, I think we have to realize, there are heavy manual workers, and we do need to look after those people who, they're physically unable to carry on. But the vast majority of us are not in those jobs, and I think different rules should apply. And we need to, be much more considerate of the different types. But if you're in an office job, it's not like you can't, from one day to the next, suddenly you can't work. But I think it's much more flexibility, and and financially it's going to be crucial, because I don't think pensions are going to be able to cope. So we have to find a solution. But I think doing different jobs, part-time, everyone doing a bit of community work or these sort of things, if you look at studies of centenarians of it as well, all the blue zones are, I was talking to Dan Burtner the other day, who got the new Netflix.
Yes, I've seen a couple of episodes.
Come on, but one of these things is it's not just the diet and the exercise; it's the sense of community, the sense of having a strong social group. As you go into your 90s, of meeting up with the same people, going for a drink, going for a coffee, and when you ask all these people, they have a sense of purpose. They're fitting into the community. They're looking after something. They're looking after grandchildren. They're looking after dogs. They are in charge of something. They might still be working, doing a little bit on the farm. We have to retain our sense of purpose.
I would also posit that we have a bit of ageism in society. And instead of looking at the older generation and saying, this is a wise and useful segment of the population, we sort of look to the, not that we shouldn't look also to the young, but we look a lot to the young to say, what's the fresh, new, exciting thing?
And what do you think there's a role that business can play in terms of driving that societal change? Getting everyone on board with that same direction. Do you think business is sort of further ahead than government or other sort of factors of society?
Business is more flexible, aren't they? They can do stuff, and they can have a long-term view, because they can say, well, we hope we're going to be in, unlike governments who aren't going to be there in 5 years, they'll be booted out. Businesses are looking at, 10, 20 years. And so having employment where, when someone retires, you automatically offer them, positions in other departments, or, you create a culture that is rather different. It's not all or nothing.
This sort of touches on a broader issue around health equity, I think. And Sarah, it'll be good to get your sense of what do we mean by health equity, and because I think that sort of is crucial to understanding the problem.
Definitely. So health equity is a topic that we've been spending a lot of time on. We've been thinking about it for a long time, but we got serious about it during COVID, when we looked around the world and saw the disparity in availability of testing and vaccines. And we've set up several health equity institutes around the world. We started in India. We have one in North and South America. We have one in Africa. And we've just launched one for the UK and Europe. And each institute is looking at different issues around health equity, whatever the most relevant is in their geography. In North America, they're looking a lot at race and ethnicity. In Africa, they're looking a lot at maternal and childhood health. In the UK and Europe, for our inaugural year, we're tackling two issues. One is disparities in access to treatment for mental health, especially for children and adolescents. And the other is disparity in diagnosis and also treatment for various types of cancer, where there's, huge dissonance between different segments of the population, which really shouldn't exist.
And I think it goes back to that sort of health and wealth correlation.
Well, the 15 years difference,
Yeah.
and, which is shocking, really, between Blackpool and Kensington. You think, and you look at other countries, the Netherlands, Belgium, Scandinavia, a lot of our neighbours don't have that. And that seems to be a crucial measure, if you like, of the overall health of the country. So, a lot of these things would be solved by, money, moving to a different area, having access to better education and food. It's out of balance, and the fact that it's out of balance affects everybody. So even that's the problem. So we do need to rebalance it, and that takes a bold move. But that's not something I don't think businesses alone can do, or authors like me can do.
So we've spoken a lot about the challenges of people living for longer. What do you see as some of the opportunities or the positive side of people living for longer?
I think bringing back together multi-generational families, giving young people the benefit of the wisdom of the older generations. I think the things that, our grandparents and great-grandparents have lived through, having them around for longer to tell us about those stories. And as things change so quickly, and I mean, my mind goes to things like, climate change and the destruction of the natural environment, like having older people around who remember, forests full of life, like we need that to help us get back to that kind of time. So I think there is a lot of just, not to sound corny, but kind of completing the circle of life, like using the wisdom of the older generation. And also, I come back to the workforce point, like we're so short of workforce now, but we do have a good tranche of able-bodied people who are looking for connection. Like maybe we should have a senior internship program here at Deloitte.
There are lots of things that you could do to encourage people to come back part-time. I think, let's be realistic. We can't see everyone working full-time till they're 85, but some people will. But there should be much more flexibility to come back that makes financial sense as well, And we just have this very rigid system that doesn't seem to account for any of it. But it's looking at other countries as well. We're very narrow in our view here, and I think we're an island nation, and we always think, we forever thought that the NHS was the best in the world, and however many people said it wasn't, it didn't matter. It was only, I started working in other countries and realised that 20, 30 years ago, it wasn't the best in the world. It might have been in the 1970s, but that was about it. And we have this view of many of our institutions that they are the best without really studying other really good models in other countries. And that goes for education.
But is there one good model which is working, or are the models always dependent on the circumstances of that particular country?
There's no one model. You just got to pick the best of all of them, really.
Yeah.
It's a pick and mix.
That's the question, George.
Yeah. Okay.
But I think where we get to is there's elements of different countries that are good that to make that ideal health system, you'd put them all together. And the other thing to note is that it tends to be smaller countries with smaller populations that tend to be able to move more quickly, digitize, or implement new models more quickly.
While we eagerly await for system reform, in the meantime,
let's take care of our guts.
Yeah, well, that was going to be my question. What would your advice be to listeners if they could change one thing or do one thing to help them perhaps live to 100? What would that be? What advice would you give?
You should go first on this one, Tim.
Well, I'd say optimize your diet, and all the studies of centenarians have shown that that's a crucial factor. You could say keeping exercise is on a par with it, but that's an easy thing. But the harder thing, I think, for people to get that head around is how to optimize your diet when there's so much conflicting information out there. I think there isn't really conflicting information about exercise, so everyone knows they're just really a bit lazy and need a nudge. But diet, what do you pick in the supermarket? Who do you listen to? What do you do? So you need to eat a mainly plant-based diet. You can still eat meat and fish, but you've got to aim for 30 vegetable plants a week. Get that diversity, because you can't just eat 30 portions of kale. That won't give the microbes the diversity species they need. The rainbow, lots of different colours, that contains these defense chemicals in foods that we're just starting to understand, called polyphenols, and they're in nuts and seeds, they're in dark chocolate, olive oil, red wine, coffee. Coffee's a health food. By the way, I'm sure there's lots of people out there that are coffee addicts. It is a health food. It's got fibre. It's got polyphenols, and so think colourful, bitter diversity there. Fermented foods, they're really good for you. Try to get, if you can, 3 portions a day. And it's not just cheese and yogurt. You've got the kefirs, the kombuchas, the krauts, but there's plenty others. If you like Japanese cuisine or Korean food, fantastic. We need to diversify our tastes. And then intermittent fasting, which this time restricted eating, which we both do, either skip breakfast, delay it, give yourself ideally a 14-hour window overnight for your gut microbes to rest. And that really energizes your metabolism. And finally, reduce your ultra-processed food intake down to Mediterranean levels, down to 10 or 15% from the 60 or 70% we are at now.
Sarah, we've got lots of great tips from Tim, which is going to really make me think about how to choose my lunch shortly. But what's the one advice that you would give to businesses thinking about this problem?
Hard to stick to one thing. I mean, I definitely would think about what are you doing for your employees today to make sure that you're enabling them to have a really long health span. And I also think about the relationship that you have with today's employees for their whole life, because I think it's a repeat game. People, as we've talked about, are going to come and go from different employers. And we might see a situation, I see this in my own practice, where people come and work in our healthcare practice for a few years. They go and work in the NHS, or they take a career break, or they move to Australia, and then they come back and they work with us again. So I think that, long-term relationship with your employees, and maybe in many different, ways. They may come and work in the press team. They may do different things.
Fantastic. Well, Tim and Sarah, this is I knew we'd run out of time. It's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much. I feel very sorry for King Charles, who's going to probably have to end up writing a lot more letters to 100-year-old birthdays.
AI will do it for him.
AI can do it for him. There you go. Well, we're trying to get him on here, actually. So, just to wrap up in a nutshell, if each of you could just answer this week's big question, which is, what if we all live to 100?
We'll all get to play with our great-great-grandchildren. How wonderful would that be?
Oh, very, very nice thought. Tim?
We'll all be able to do the things that we wanted to do, and otherwise, would run out of time. So I think, and particularly stay close to as many friends and be as, keep that human skill of sociability.
Tim and Sarah, thank you very much for coming.
Thanks,
Pleasure.
George.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Annie.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Green Room by Deloitte. We'll be back next time with another big question. This podcast is produced by our very own pod squad and is hosted by George Parrott, Lizzie Elston, Ethan Worth and Annie Wong. Thanks to our creative studio for their technical support. Original music by Ali Barrett.